Imagine losing your child. The funeral is over. The grave is covered. You believe your son or daughter can finally rest in peace. But months later, someone secretly opens the grave. Not to steal jewelry, not to identify the body, but to remove the bones, without asking permission, without telling the family, without leaving any evidence. This wasn't a horror movie. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It wasn't something that happened hundreds of years ago. It happened during the Cold War, and it was organized by scientists working for governments. The project had an innocent name, Project Sunshine, but behind that cheerful title lay one of the most disturbing scientific programs of the 20th century. To understand why this happened, we first need to go back to a world living in constant fear. A world where humanity had unlocked a force it barely understood. The atom. By the early 1950s, the Second World War had ended, but peace never truly arrived. Instead, the world entered a new kind of conflict. The Cold War. America and the Soviet Union were locked in a race unlike anything in history. Not just for power, not just for influence, but for survival. Every new bomb was more powerful than the last. In 1945, the world witnessed Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. Humanity had entered the nuclear age, and nobody knew what would happen next. Scientists understood explosions, but they didn't fully understand what happened after the explosion. Invisible radioactive particles could travel thousands of miles, across oceans, across continents, across entire generations. No one knew how dangerous that invisible dust might become. There was only one way to find out: study the people exposed to it. One radioactive element worried scientists more than almost any other: strontium-90. Unlike many radioactive particles, it behaved almost exactly like calcium. When children drank milk or ate food contaminated by nuclear fallout, their bodies couldn't tell the difference. Instead of rejecting it, their bones absorbed it. The younger the child, the greater the danger. Because growing bones absorbed calcium faster, which also meant they absorbed more strontium-90. Scientists needed to know one thing: how much radioactive material was already inside the human skeleton. But there was a problem. There was no machine capable of measuring it accurately. Not yet. There was only one way. They needed real human bones. They needed real human bones. Not one skeleton, not 10, not even 100. They needed thousands. From infants, from teenagers, from adults, from people living in different countries, different climates, different diets, different stages of life. Because every human skeleton told a different story. Scientists believed that by comparing bones from around the world, they could estimate how much radioactive fallout had entered the global population. At first glance, it sounded like reasonable science. After all, the Cold War had created a problem no one had ever faced before. Never in human history had radioactive particles been released into the atmosphere on such a scale. Between 1945 and the early 1960s, more than 400 nuclear weapons were detonated in the atmosphere. Each explosion launched radioactive material high into the sky. Winds carried those particles across oceans, across continents, sometimes across the entire planet. Rain brought them back down, into rivers, onto farmland, into drinking water, and eventually, onto dinner tables. The frightening part was that no one could see any of it. There was no smell, no color, no warning. A child could be playing outside, while invisible radioactive dust slowly settled onto the ground around them. Grass absorbed it. Cows ate the grass. Milk carried the radioactive particles. Children drank the milk, and the particles entered their bones. It was an invisible chain, one that connected nuclear tests in remote deserts to ordinary families thousands of miles away. Scientists called this process radioactive fallout. Today, it sounds obvious. Back then, It was one of the biggest unanswered scientific questions on Earth. Governments desperately wanted answers, not only to protect people, but also to understand what a future nuclear war might do to entire populations. And this is where science began crossing ethical lines. Project Sunshine officially began in 1953. It involved scientists from multiple countries. The United States played the leading role, but researchers in Britain, Australia, Canada, South America, and several other regions also contributed samples and data. Officially, the project was designed to measure strontium-90 inside human bones. Unofficially, it became something much larger. Because finding enough human bones proved far more difficult than anyone expected. Hospitals had only limited numbers. Medical schools couldn't supply enough specimens. Researchers needed thousands of samples every year, especially from young children. Why children? Because their skeletons were still growing. Growing bones absorb calcium faster than adult bones, and because strontium-90 behaves almost exactly like calcium. Children accumulated much higher concentrations than adults. From a scientific perspective, they were the most valuable subjects. From an ethical perspective, they were the most vulnerable. That single fact would shape everything that followed. Soon, scientists weren't simply waiting for samples to arrive. They began actively searching for them. And in some cases, they searched without anyone's knowledge, without consent, without permission. Families believed they had said their final goodbye. Many never knew that organs and bones had been removed before burial and quietly sent to toxic laboratories, participating in Project Sunshine. There was only one problem. Hospitals couldn't provide enough samples. Medical schools had only a limited number of skeletons. Existing collections were simply too small. Project Sunshine needed something much larger. Thousands of bone samples, every single year. Scientists soon realized they couldn't rely on chance. If they wanted reliable data, they needed a permanent collection network, and that is exactly what they built. Quietly, across multiple continents, hospitals, pathology departments, medical examiners, and university laboratories all became part of an international effort. Many of the doctors involved believed they were serving an important scientific purpose. Some knew exactly what Project Sunshine was. Others only received simple instructions. Collect bone samples, record the age, record the location, send the material. No questions asked. The scientists weren't interested in entire skeletons. In most cases, they only needed a few specific bones, especially the femur, the thigh bone. It is the largest bone in the human body, and because it constantly stores calcium, it also stores strontium-90. For researchers, it became one of the most valuable pieces of evidence. Children's bones were even more important. Not because children were targeted, but because their growing skeletons absorbed radioactive material much faster than adults. Every sample represented data. Every data point helped scientists estimate how much radioactive fallout was entering the human population. From a scientific perspective, it made perfect sense. From today's perspective, it raises difficult ethical questions. The project expanded rapidly. By the mid-1950s, samples were arriving from countries across the world: Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Germany, and many others. Each shipment contained another small piece of the same puzzle: how much radioactive fallout had entered the human body. Scientists worked day and night. Bone samples were cleaned, dried, labeled, cataloged, then carefully analyzed using increasingly sophisticated laboratory techniques. The numbers slowly began to tell a story. And that story frightened everyone. Strontium-90 was everywhere. It wasn't limited to nuclear test sites. It wasn't limited to military bases. It had entered farms, cities, schools, homes. It had become part of everyday life. Then came one of the most disturbing discoveries. Children born after the first wave of atmospheric nuclear tests contained significantly higher levels of strontium-90 than children born only a few years earlier. Every new generation was carrying a little more radioactive material than the last. The scientists finally had proof. Nuclear testing wasn't staying in the desert. It was spreading across the planet, invisible, silent, and impossible to stop. Ironically, Project Sunshine was beginning to produce exactly the evidence governments feared. The fallout was real, the contamination was measurable, and every new nuclear explosion made the numbers worse. But there was another secret, one the public would not discover for many years: how those samples had actually been collected. And once that truth became public, Project Sunshine would be remembered for something very different than science. For years, Project Sunshine remained largely unknown outside scientific circles. Its reports were read by researchers, government officials, and military planners. But ordinary people had no idea what had happened. Then, decades later, documents began to emerge. Journalists started asking questions. Families discovered that tissue and bone samples had been collected without their informed consent in many cases. The public reaction was immediate. People were shocked, not because scientists wanted to understand radiation. Most agreed that measuring radioactive contamination was important. They were shocked by how it had been done. Project Sunshine forced the world to ask a difficult question. How far should science go when the goal is protecting humanity? Can a good intention justify taking something from a family without their knowledge? There were no easy answers. There still aren't. Yet the project also revealed something that could not be ignored. The data collected from thousands of samples confirmed that radioactive fallout from atmospheric nuclear testing was entering the human body. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't theory. It was measurable, and the evidence became impossible to dismiss. Scientists, public health experts, and policymakers increasingly warned that continued atmospheric testing posed real risks. Public concern grew around the world. Eventually, political pressure followed. In 1963, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The treaty prohibited nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space. Underground testing continued, but one of the largest sources of global radioactive fallout had been dramatically reduced. Project Sunshine did not end nuclear weapons, but its findings became part of the scientific evidence that helped change international policy. Today, the project is remembered for two very different reasons. One is scientific, the other is ethical. It helped us understand how radioactive materials move through the human body, but it also reminded the world that scientific progress must never come at the cost of basic human dignity. Every breakthrough carries responsibility. Every discovery has consequences, and history has shown that fear can sometimes convince good people to make terrible decisions. Project Sunshine was born from the fear of nuclear war. It produced knowledge that protected future generations, but it also left behind a question that still echoes today. When does protecting humanity stop looking human? History is rarely black and white. The people behind Project Sunshine were not movie villains. Many believed they were preventing an even greater catastrophe. Others simply followed orders. Yet good intentions alone cannot replace transparency. They cannot replace consent, and they cannot erase the pain of families who never knew the full story. Perhaps that is the real lesson. Not that science is dangerous, but that science without ethics can become something we no longer recognize. Because every page of history reminds us of the same truth. The darkest stories rarely begin with evil. They begin with people convinced they are doing the right thing. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy forgotten stories like this, consider subscribing. Because history still holds countless secrets waiting to be uncovered. History doesn't only tell us what happened, it reminds us what can happen again if we stop asking questions.